This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 195 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 12 was a lot better than Week 11. Quarterback was probably one of my weaker positions, but a lot of it had to do with what I talked about on that show. There were a lot of good quarterback plays last week. I mentioned Lamar Jackson, Jameis Winston, and Baker Mayfield as good plays, but I did give deeper options in Eli Manning and Nick Mullins, who didn't really hit. And then Deshaun Watson, who I thought was a tad overranked, did more with his legs last week than he has in a while, making him super fantasy relevant. And I'm now 0 for 2 with my Deshaun Watson picks this year. But Gus Edwards and Josh Adams were good, Austin Eckler came through, Adrian Peterson was predictably bad, Adam Humphries was strong, and then there was the deep call of Keith Kirkwood, who found the end zone. He didn't get as much love through the air as I'd like to see, but the Saints scored 2 slot touchdowns last week. That was the matchup that I talked about on the show as a good one. So overall, like I said, it was a lot better last week than the week prior. Before we look at players with good and bad matchups this week, I wanted to let you guys know that you should be playing the single game slate tonight on FanDuel. You've got the Cowboys and Saints going at it with lots of fantasy potential, so why not get a piece of that game by playing the Thursday night special? Just go to FanDuel.com and check it out. I've gotten a lot of questions about Jameis Winston this week, and in short, yes, you should probably be playing him. The combination of Winston and Ryan Fitzpatrick have provided the second most fantasy points at the quarterback position this year. Only Patrick Mahomes has more points than Tampa Bay quarterback. The Bucs are going to be facing Carolina, a team that's surrendered the 6th most fantasy points per game to the position. The Panthers have also allowed a top 10 performance in 3 of their last 4. So Winston, for me, is a very solid QB1. And then there's Lamar Jackson, who I think the consensus may be too low on this week. He posted 20 fantasy points in Week 12, and that was with 2 interceptions. He didn't run the ball 27 times like he did in his debut, but he took off 11 times, adding 71 yards and a score on the ground. So he's going to give you a nice floor with his legs week in and week out. We know this. But there's also the upside of not only facing a weak defense, but a team in general that has a strong offense. Jackson didn't need to do as much last week because they were facing the Raiders. This week, they're in Atlanta to take on one of the better offenses in football. Since week 1, Atlanta's allowed 20 or more fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in 8 of 10 games played. And for what it's worth, they rank 7th in yards allowed to quarterbacks on the ground. With this game projected to be close with a 49-point over-under in a dome, you should be into Lamar Jackson this week. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, I do kind of think that Case Keenum is in play. Cincinnati's been awful defensively this year, and they're now the worst team in terms of fantasy points against to quarterbacks. And this game could easily hit the over. The over-under is currently 42. But Cincinnati ranks 4th in seconds per play this year, while Denver ranks 5th. And in neutral game script situations, both teams rank in the top 8. So that means more plays may be run, which benefits both offenses. And against this miserable Cincinnati defense, more plays could mean more points for Case Keenum. Baker Mayfield has been awesome with Freddie Kitchens as offensive coordinator, averaging over 22 points per game since the switch at OC happened. And I think Kitchens and what he's doing with that offense is awesome. But I do think we have to realize that they've also faced Kansas City, Atlanta, and Cincinnati over their last 3 games. Those are 3 of the 4 top teams in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season. The Texans aren't as favorable of a matchup, and that's especially true since they're playing in Houston. I know Marcus Mariota just tore them up on Monday night, going 22 for 23 through the air, but the Texans have been fine for most of the season, even when you adjust for strength of opponent. Because it's true, they haven't really faced a lot of tough passers this year. Essentially, Mayfield is a mid to low end QB2 this week, considering the schedule component. This is mostly me just letting you guys know that as much as I love Baker Mayfield, I think we have to be reasonable about his fantasy outlook and how and why he's done what he's done over the last few weeks. I do think some of it has been matchup driven. Lastly, I think Tom Brady could find the bench on some teams this week. You may not be able to, but in shallower leagues, he's sort of a risky start. Minnesota has allowed multiple touchdown passes in just 2 games this year, and they've held Aaron Rodgers twice, Jimmy Garoppolo, Drew Brees, and Matthew Stafford to 1 or fewer touchdown passes. Brady was fine this past week, but let's not pretend that he's been this plug-and-play option all season long. He's actually finished as a QB1 or a top 12 quarterback in just 4 of 11 games. So given the matchup, I'd be playing players like Jameis Winston and Lamar Jackson over Tom Brady this week. Kenyon Drake was someone that I had as a sell in this week's 15 Transactions podcast, if you heard it earlier in the week, and that was due to his inconsistent play. And I stand by my recommendation. I do think there's some intrigue with his matchup this week against Buffalo, though. The Bills have been pretty average in rushing yards against this year to running backs, and the same could be said with how many receiving yards they've given up to the position as well. But when you take the Bills' receiving yards allowed and you divvy it up between what they've allowed to running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, they've been significantly worse at running back. Almost 23% of the receiving yards that they've given up this year has gone to backs. That's the second highest rate in the league behind only the Chargers. So from that perspective, Kenyon Drake is actually kind of an interesting option. He's seen at least 6 targets in 5 of his last 7 games. So it wouldn't shock me if he's utilized in the passing game once again this week. Tariq Cohen is also a strong play in Week 13, and you could honestly make an argument for Jordan Howard as well, but only as a deeper play. The Giants have been a lot worse at stopping opposing backs since they traded Snacks Harrison. Before the trade, running backs were averaging 3.9 yards per carry against the Giants. Since, they're averaging 5.1 yards per attempt. We've watched Adrian Peterson run as a top 5 back against them. Matt Breida ranked as an RB6, Peyton Barber was RB10, and Josh Adams was RB18, with Corey Clement as RB25 last week. Those are all games without Snacks Harrison. They've been bad against the position, and Tariq Cohen should absolutely be able to take advantage. And maybe Jordan Howard as well. Theo Riddick is a pretty interesting option for those of you in PPR leagues. Since his return in Week 9, he's averaged 7.3 targets per game. But he's seeing them very, very consistently. He's seen 8, 7, 7, and 7 targets over his last 4. So we should probably consider that close to his floor against a Rams team that's a big favorite. Detroit trailing in this game would mean that they would be forced to throw the ball more, which would benefit Theo Riddick. And Jalen Richard is another pass-catching back that you could look at as a flex option this week. He saw just 4 targets and 1 rush last week in a negative script against the Ravens, but he still was on the field for about 45% of the team's snaps. There's nothing wrong with that for a pass-catching back. The Raiders are big underdogs against Kansas City this week, and the Chiefs have given up the most receiving yards to running backs this year by far. They've also allowed the most receiving touchdowns to the position, and as it stands, Jalen Richard is one of the top positive touchdown regression candidates at running back across the league. He's accumulated 447 receiving yards without a touchdown, when the NFL average at running back over the last half decade or so has been a touchdown on every 229 yards. So maybe this is the week that he finally shares his touchdown celebration. As of this recording, Dalvin Cook is being ranked as RB20 in PPR formats over on Fantasy Pros, and I'm scared to be that confident in him. The matchup is below average, and Cook has also peaked at 16.6 PPR points this season in a single week. If you look at how running backs have produced against New England, it's most definitely been through the air. They've given up 5 top 20 performances this year, or performances where a back had 15 or more PPR points, and in those games, 4 of the 5 backs had 6 or more targets. The only one who didn't was Derrick Henry, who had 2 fluky touchdowns in a positive game script. The receiving volume could be there for Cook, but he's also hit more than 5 targets in just 1 game this year. So I'm just a little bit wary of his ranking and think he should be about 5 or so spots lower. And then here's my new weekly Adrian Peterson is a risky play recommendation. I talked about his splits in losses last week, and it didn't get much better with a 35-yard effort on the ground in Week 12. He's now scored 8 or fewer PPR points in 4 of Washington's 5 losses this season. And they're decent underdogs this week against Philly. There's also a chance that Chris Thompson is back. That may not only limit AP's passing game potential, which is not a lot to begin with, but it also would hurt his overall volume as well. Josh Reynolds is someone that I like a good bit this week at wide receiver. He saw 8 targets for 75 yards and a score the last time that we saw him, and according to Pro Football Focus, in that game against the Chiefs, he ran 51 routes, which was right up there with Robert Woods. The Lions have Darius Slay, and he could see Josh Reynolds at times throughout this game. But we shouldn't overstate that matchup when the Lions have been a top half team in points allowed to wide receivers this year. Don't play Reynolds over obvious starters this week, but I think you could do worse given what we saw from the Cooper Cup-less Rams in Week 11. When I was looking at Fantasy Pros prepping for this podcast to see how people were viewing particular players, I was shocked to see Bruce Ellington ranked as wide receiver 71 this week. I'm not like amazingly high on Ellington or anything, but that's a little confusing considering his recent play and the fact that Marvin Jones is now on IR. Over the team's last 2 games, Ellington has seen 16 targets. He's playing more slot snaps than any other Detroit wide receiver. And this is a game where, like I said earlier with Theo Riddick, the Lions will likely be trailing. That means more passes. Now, the matchup isn't very easy for Ellington in the slot against the Rams, but he should still be ranked higher than he is. The last time Carolina and Tampa Bay played each other, Adam Humphries caught all 8 of his targets for 82 yards and a pair of touchdowns. He's now scored 4 times in his last 4 games, and with Jameis Winston under center this year, Humphries has seen the second most targets on the Bucs, trailing only Mike Evans by 4. It's a good matchup for him, and I think he's a really, really solid wide receiver 3 this week in PPR formats. Tyler Boyd gets a likely downgrade at quarterback with Andy Dalton out for the year, and against Denver this week, he'll face a lot of Chris Harris Jr. Boyd's played in the slot on 74% of his snaps in 2018, where he's seen 633 of his 841 receiving yards. That's all according to Pro Football Focus. But Harris Jr. is tied for 4th best in yards allowed per snap in the slot, making this a really tough matchup for Tyler Boyd. Calvin Ridley is ranked pretty high this week, and I think it's partially because he's coming off a game where he saw 13 targets. But he still played fewer snaps than both Julio Jones and Mohamed Sanu in that game against New Orleans, and more importantly, he hasn't really seen that kind of volume consistently this year. Heading into Week 12, he combined for 9 targets in his 2 prior games. And then this week, the Falcons are facing Baltimore, a team that's given up the 5th fewest points to the wide receiver position this year. I do think Calvin Ridley is fine, I just think he's a little bit overvalued this week. With Jack Doyle on IR, Eric Ebron should absolutely be in your lineup. He's seen a target share north of 22% without Doyle this year, and he's tied for the league lead at tight end in red zone targets. He's a plug-and-play option from here on out. I just felt like I needed to let you guys know that. Cameron Brate's also in a great spot this week against Carolina. Without O.J. Howard in the lineup last week, Brate ranked in the top 10 in routes run, and he was able to find the end zone on one of his 4 targets. His opponent this week, again, it's Carolina. They've given up the most fantasy points to tight ends this year. So to me, Cameron Brate is a top 10 option. If you want a little bit of a deeper play, Tyler Higbee or Gerald Everett could be worthwhile streamers. Higbee ran more routes and saw more volume through the air than Everett the last time the Rams played, and that's why I'd probably prefer him slightly to Everett. But Everett's found the end zone 3 times over his last 2 games, and he has more red zone targets across this time. So maybe the look is that Higbee has the floor and Everett has the ceiling. But without Cooper Kupp, there's some opportunity for these Rams tight ends to step up. There are a ton of good defensive plays this week. Tennessee is one of those defenses that you should most definitely consider because they're facing the Jets. The Jets have allowed a top 10 defensive performance in 4 of their last 5 games. During this time, they've been picked off twice and sacked 2.6 times per game. Considering the Titans are big home favorites, they're most definitely worth a look. I also like the Packers against Arizona. They're at home and they're heavy favorites. And Arizona just hands fantasy points to opposing defenses. The only defense to not rank in the top 8 against them over the last 6 weeks has been Oakland. And we know that Oakland struggles defensively. And during this time, the Cardinals have surrendered 3.5 sacks per game. That pairs up nicely with Green Bay, a team that's 5th in adjusted sack rate across the league. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And as always, if you're on iTunes, please leave me a rating and review. I'm also on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be in your ears tomorrow with a weekly mailbag episode.